So this evening our topic is mineral and vitamin nutrition, and our speaker is Dr. Dan Morrical from Iowa State University. I think I called him an icon yesterday, and I think it's a good description because when it comes to nutrition with small ruminants, especially sheep, he's the go-to guy. So when I thought about a nutrition topic, he was the first person that came to mind. And so he's going to cover mineral and vitamin nutrition of sheep and goats for us this evening. And I will mute my mic at that.
So is it my turn? Okay,
yes.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be on the webinar tonight, and I appreciate Susan's invitation. I will tell you offhand right away that I don't really like doing webinars because I can't see your faces. I can't make jokes and hear you laugh. I tend to talk fast enough already, and then I really talk fast on this webinar. Now, the other thing you will realize as we go through these slides, there are zero sheep pictures. So it's boring slides, it's all numbers, all text. We'll struggle through it. You get questions, you send them in. Susan will send them back to me, and we'll get them answered. I can be on for a couple hours. It doesn't matter when we get done. The other thing is I've got my phone number on the first slide. I got my email address. If I don't get your questions answered tonight, and specifically like the one that's up there, the long goat question on calcium, I just soon do that tomorrow in an email. We can email back and forth, and we can do those things. And maybe I'll answer it as we go through. But all right. So, and then Susan's already helping me out. We have two software packages. They do ration balancing, one for sheep, one for goats. They're $50, so they're not very expensive. They run in Excel. They're pretty easy to use once you try them a few times and work really well. So, all right. So we're going to talk about vitamins and minerals. My education, I grew up in Indiana. I went to school at Purdue University. I spent a year on a farrow-to-finish operation of my neighbors once I graduated from Purdue. Then I went to graduate school at New Mexico State University. And Susan, I think, got her degree at Montana State. Rodney Cott, who was at Montana State's now retired, was in graduate school with me. At one time, there were 4 sheep specialists around the country that all got their degrees at New Mexico State. So let's go through the slides. So our objective is supplement vitamins and minerals to meet the animal's needs because our forages, our grains are not balanced for what the sheep and goats need. I worry all the time about what things cost. So I'll talk about cost, whether it's price effective, etc. And the last thing that's really important is our sheep, our goats, livestock cannot read the mineral labels. They cannot read the feed tags. They cannot see that they're supposed to eat a half an ounce of mineral a day and not an ounce, or none at all, for that matter. So we've got to take charge as shepherds and goat herders in terms of figuring out what the sheep and goats need. So let's talk about minerals first. When we have minerals, we talk about basically the macro, which is on the left side of the slide. That's calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. They are required in percentages in the diet. So for example, calcium, I was working on some lactation rations today for ewes raising triplets, and the calcium requirement was like 0.65%. But still, not a lot, not a high amount in the ration. The micro minerals are zinc, selenium, copper, cobalt, manganese, iron, and iodine. Those are in parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. There's 450 grams in a pound, and so those compare quite well. I use the example all the time. The state of Iowa has about 3.2 million people. So Dr. Morrical in the state of Iowa is equivalent to 0.3 parts per million. So when we get to parts per million, we're not talking very much. So we got to be careful not to weigh those feeds out. Now this slide does not come through very well because I scanned it out of a book. But I think it's really important to us as we think about mineral deficiencies over time. Let's say we've been feeding them really good. We've had a good mineral out there, and all of a sudden we decide we're going to save money and feed salt and no mineral. So as those goats and sheep go, as we go from where they're adequate and over time, may take a month, may take 6 months, you see that as we, first thing that happens is, even though we won't see any clinical disease, we can impact the immunity or the ability of animals to fight off diseases. As we go further with no mineral intake and develop a deficiency status, we impact growth and fertility. And then if we leave them on long enough, we actually see clinical signs like goiter with an iodine deficiency, like stiff lamb disease or white muscle disease in baby lambs. I think goats tend to need iodine more than sheep because I've had more complaints about goiter in goats than I have in sheep. So that mineral takes time to become deficient, but some of those things happen to us before we actually see signs. So that's, I think, a real important thing to remember. The next slide is really busy because it's got all the minerals on there. But the important thing to remember, and I've got copper highlighted down here on the bottom. I keep not grabbing the arrow. Down here, copper. In sheep, we worry about that because it would cause poisoning with too much copper most of the time. If we're feeding a lot of sulfur, a lot of iron, and a lot of molybdenum, we can reduce the copper absorption and get away with that. Whereas goats tend to need more copper, they're like cattle, and so we don't really need to feed molybdenum to our goats. All right, so as we think about the antagonism, if iron is relatively low on this slide at below 50 parts per million, which means you've done a really good job of not raking your hay because you don't have any dirt in it, because that's basically where all of our iron is coming from, is the dirt contamination. 200 to 400 parts per million on iron is marginally antagonistic, so it really impacts copper absorption. If we're over 400 parts per million on iron, we are definitely going to pull down the copper levels. You'll notice on molybdenum, 1 to 3 parts per million. In our state, in Iowa, we have copper poisoning in sheep. And it's mostly because our molybdenum is down around 0.5 to 1. So the sheep are doing a really nice job of absorbing copper. You'll notice we get above 0.2% sulfur, we start pulling a lot of copper, taking copper out. We get above 0.3, we do even higher, and we've seen that with some of our distillers' diets because they use sulfuric acid in the system. So we get that sulfur ends up in the distillers' products. And obviously, if we get above 1,000 on iron, we're above the critical level. Molybdenum at 5. If we had 5 parts per million molybdenum, we're in a situation where we'd have to feed a lot of copper. And I have a client that I've worked with in Ohio on strip mines that he grazes. His molybdenum levels are about 6. And I was actually adding like 35 parts per million copper to his rations. But not before I had him sign a waiver, because I didn't want to pay for dead sheep with copper poisoning. Okay, the next slide's got a lot of data on it. This is a forage survey we did back in 2010. Notice on grass, manganese levels, depending on whether you're set for, 1 is southern Iowa, 2 is north central, 3 I think is northern or vice versa. Uh, the grass variation zinc, we need about 33 at least parts per million zinc in the sheep's diet. You can see in most cases we're short. Copper, we're pretty good shape other than some legumes here at 16. I had a forage sample the other day we did in class for the sheep class that I teach, and it was over 20 parts per million copper, and I am nervous. It also was like 12% ash, so the kids had raked the hay a little too good, or we have way too many gophers and got too much dirt in the hay. The real important thing to look on this slide, if we look at the iron levels, we're from 240 to almost 600, so very antagonistic on copper, as well as some of the other minerals. So when we think about mineral needs, biologically critical times for the trace minerals is stress time. So we think about stress, it increases urinary excretion of copper and zinc. So stress times are weaning. Putting them on a truck and hauling them. Parasitism and lactation. Those are all stressful time periods. Coyote attacks, dog attacks can create a lot of stress. It may be short-term on coyotes, dogs. Once they start, obviously, they keep working the flock, and it's a lot of problems. Reproductively, conception and fetal development. We got to have the micro minerals in there for it to work. We got to have enough mineral intake and the micro minerals to get it to the liver of the fetuses. For example, selenium. Selenium crosses the placenta. So if we get enough selenium into the ewes in late gestation, we shouldn't have a selenium problem in the lambs at birth. Our immune response. If we don't have enough of the micro minerals, and we're really talking about zinc, selenium, copper, and I can't remember the other one. I think there's 4 of them that are all involved in the immune system, but we won't generate as good a response to our vaccination and titer levels. Our neutrophil functions are minimized, and so the animals can't fight off a disease challenge. So that's why the micro minerals are really important. That's why we can't just feed salt. So the animal's needs vary dependent upon what stage of production they're in. So if we think about lactation on ewes, that's the high level intake time. It's the high level of calcium and phosphorus. We talked about the antagonisms already. Age, ewe lambs, lambs that are growing may have a much higher requirement for the minerals than adults. And then the level of production, whether they're carrying 1, 2, or 3 lambs in utero, whether they're milking, and then also generally the faster they grow, the more they eat, so it really doesn't increase their concentration of the mineral they need, but it does increase the total amount they need. So here's an example of ewe lambs versus mature ewes. In early lactation, the calcium requirement would be 8.6 for ewe lambs. Mature ewes is 12 grams, so almost a 50% increase, at least a third if I do the math right. So do we know why that is? Why is that? Why is there that big a difference? Yes, and everything's the same for goats. I just don't know what the goats' milk production levels are. These ewe lambs are probably producing 3 to 4 pounds of milk, whereas the ewes with twins on them are probably producing 6 to 8 to 10 pounds of milk. So it's a lot more production out of the old ewes, the mature ewes, because they're bigger and they milk heavier. So they also have a higher phosphorus requirement, 11 grams. Now the first question that we had tonight was on math and doing the calculations. So let's take these lactating ewes. We assume they're eating 4.5 pounds of alfalfa hay and 2 pounds of corn during lactation. And that would be ewes weighing 175 to 200 pounds. Pretty good size sheep, polypay type crosses. So the phosphorus level in alfalfa hay is 0.24%. So 4.5 pounds times 0.24 gives us 1/100 of a pound of phosphorus out of the hay. 2 pounds of corn is 0.35% phosphorus. That gives us 7 thousandths of a pound of phosphorus, or 0.017 pounds of P, times 454 grams per pound, right? That's how many grams are in a pound of feed. So that base ration, our 4.5 pounds of hay, I keep hitting, and 2 pounds of corn gives us 7.7 grams of phosphorus, but the ewe needed 11. So we need to supplement her with a mineral that has phosphorus in it. We could use dical, or she's going to pull it out of her bones. And hopefully she doesn't have to pull too much out, because that'll make her bones brittle or weak and we'll have some problems, and she just won't milk as much. So when we think about meeting the animal's needs, mineral consumption. Okay, I haven't said this yet. I'm going to say it a lot. Sheep have no nutritional wisdom. They do not know what's good for them. They will eat corn out of the bucket until they die. They do not know to stop at 2 pounds. So what drives mineral intake is salt. That's what they're craving when they eat mineral. Now, the feed companies put other things in the mineral to get adequate intake, because most of those mineral products, like zinc oxide, manganese oxide, those are not very palatable. One of the worst ones is magnesium oxide for grass tetany. So they have to mix molasses or grain byproducts to get the sheep to eat it at all. So then the mineral density is also important. So how much they eat per day, and then also the density of the minerals in the feed. And selenium can vary from 10 to 90 parts per million in terms of how much is in that mineral mix. The FDA controls how much selenium we can feed per day, and it's 0.69 milligrams. Or in a trace mineral salt, 90 parts per million. The other reason I don't like webinars is you guys don't ask me questions and I can't take a drink so I can wet my whistle. So we got the mineral as one source for what these sheep get. Now we got feedstuffs. Alfalfa hay we talked about. It's high in calcium. If your base rations that you're feeding your ewes, your goats, is alfalfa, you do not need to give them extra calcium. So now we go on to sheep minerals, or goat minerals, or livestock minerals. They contain both macro and micro minerals. So they've got all the macros, which would be calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sulfur, potassium. They also contain all the micros: iodine, selenium, zinc, manganese, cobalt, etc. All right, so normally on the sheep minerals, it's 10 to 12% calcium, 6 to 10% phosphorus. So if we're feeding that lactating ewe that was short a 10% phosphorus mineral, she's probably getting enough because she only needed 3 or 4 grams. The mineral will contain 10 to probably up to 50% salt. And if it's only got 10% salt in the mineral, they will eat a bunch, right? Because they're craving salt. Whereas if it's 50% salt, they'll probably only eat a half an ounce. The other thing about sheep goat minerals, those complete minerals, they're going to be more expensive. They're going to cost you 20 to 50 bucks for a 50-pound bag. And the reason they're more expensive is they've got a lot less salt. Phosphorus is being put in the ration, and it's coming from dicalcium phosphate, probably. And dical's like $500 a ton right now. So that's why the minerals are more expensive. So here's an example of a sheep mineral that a guy sent me from Kansas. It's 7% calcium, 5% phosphorus, 45% salt, 1% sulfur, 1% mag, and then it's got all these others on the parts per million. So it's got 150 parts per million zinc, which is short. It's okay on iodine, it's okay on cobalt, but it's super, super short on selenium. Probably should have been 45 to 50 parts per million selenium. And if I wanted to make this mineral better, I probably would take the calcium out, because if I'm feeding legumes, alfalfa, I don't need it. If I'm feeding corn, if I'm feeding any grain or grain byproducts, I'm probably getting enough phosphorus there, so I don't need it. And I can make it cheaper. Now here's the mineral I use. It's Big Gain Trace Mineral Salt. It's 95 to 98% salt. It contains only the micro minerals. Because it's so high in salt, the ewes don't eat very much, or the goats don't eat very much. So it's a lot cheaper. I can buy it for $12 a bag, and they eat half as much. So I can cut my mineral cost by about 25% versus using the all-purpose minerals. Now, if I'm feeding a grass or pasturing my ewes on mostly grass pastures, they don't have a lot of calcium in them. So then I probably need to use a full-blown mineral. Okay. When you ask questions, Susan, I see it moving on where, so I got distracted. The other way sheep get minerals is through the water. Many of us have hard water. Okay, that's got a lot of mineral content. The worst case scenario, if we think about sulfur, potentially tying up selenium intake, if we got high sulfur water, which smells like rotten eggs, those of you that don't have high sulfur water, just be glad. And so we need to account for that water intake and the minerals coming out of the water as well. All right, here's my Big Gain Trace Mineral Salt. It's 94 for 95% salt. Zinc's 6,000 parts per million. So way more than the general mineral. 5,200 on magnesium. 2,500 on manganese. Now notice, guys, 0.125% or 0.25%. If we want to convert percentages to parts per million, we just add 4 decimal places. So if we move the decimal place over 4, that gets us to 2,500. So that's a quick rule of thumb to convert these percentages to parts per million. Iodine is still short in the Big Gain Trace Mineral Salt. Cobalt's okay. Selenium's at the max, is at 90 parts per million. Then the other thing, when you look at these feed labels, the ingredients will be listed from most to least. So salt's the first ingredient listed, it's the most. Vegetable oil is in there as a binder to kind of keep everything held together so stuff doesn't separate out. And notice there's none of that byproducts, no molasses, things to get the sheep to eat or goats to eat this mineral mix. And then feeding directions. Big Gain Trace Mineral Salt. Do not permit excessive consumption. 0.3 parts per million on a complete basis, or 0.69 milligrams. So they can eat, if they eat 1/4 of an ounce a day, they get 0.63 milligrams of selenium, and it's good to go. Now, here's the problem. The feed companies think they know what your sheep are going to eat. But between Texas and Maine and Illinois and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa and Indiana, the feeds that we feed are different. But most of the feed companies have one mineral source, one mineral they put together. So they try to cover the whole gamut of what can be out there. They also try to make sure, don't really rely much on the minerals, especially trace minerals that are in the forages or in the diet. So they make sure you got plenty, because they don't want to be sued. So if I'm trying to figure out my program, what I should do, the first thing I would do is test my forages for macro minerals. I can get a NIR test run on my hay or my forage, and the hay is going to be pretty, if it's off the same farm, it's going to be very similar to the standing forage, at least if it's compositionally the same. So if it's alfalfa standing, alfalfa hay, grass standing, grass hay. So that gives you an idea where you're at on macros. Mineral intake, we need to monitor it. I like to put out a week's supply at once. So, and see how long it lasts. Try to stretch that out so they don't overconsume. So, selenium deficiency. Probably the most common deficiency we have, I think, in terms of minerals in the country. Reproductive failure. If it's really bad, they aren't going to breed, they aren't going to settle. We see embryonic mortality at weeks 3 and 4. The one where normally everybody knows about stiff lamb disease or white muscle disease, poor suckling reflex, so the tongue muscles don't work as well on a selenium deficient sheep or goat kid. Indirectly, selenium can have an impact on hypothermia and goiter because this enzyme, deiodinase enzyme, contains selenium, and it converts I4 to I3, which is the biologically active form. And it's needed for brown adipose tissue, BAT, activity. Other things, selenium will reduce growth and reduce disease resistance. So we don't want to be selenium deficient. Now, in your flocks, if you have to treat baby lambs and your kids with selenium at birth, you have a selenium deficiency that your mineral and base ration is not taking care of. We need to fix the diet, not just keep giving them shots. I do not like to give shots to anything. So best management practice for selenium. Read our mineral labels. Monitor the intake, add to the grain mix, and force feed it. There is a tremendous animal-to-animal variation in, I see some typos here, not typos, but formatting errors, in how much mineral they'll eat. I had some ewe lambs on a study once, and they were eating 4 ounces a day of a mineral that they were supposed to eat a half an ounce. They obviously could not read. The minerals are needed year-round. Now on selenium, if some is good, more is not better. It can be toxic at 2 parts per million. So we've got 0.3 parts per million is our requirement. So we only have a 6-fold spread between what we need and what can kill the sheep. And as I already mentioned, high sulfur, either through distillers or high sulfur water, can decrease the selenium absorption and increase our likelihood of having a deficiency. Iodine, our second most common problem, deficiency in the diagnostic lab at Iowa State University. It's the most common one at South Dakota State University. And so it really bothers me in this day and age we can still have iodine deficiencies. Classic symptom is goiter. The new NRC for sheep and goats increased the iodine requirements about 3-fold. Most mineral mixtures are short. We need to be at that 140 parts per million with a half an ounce of intake. How I've gotten around that is I put out free choice iodized salt in late gestation to get more salt into the ewes. The iodine crosses the placenta and I get iodine into the lambs. All right, so we think about iodine deficiency. The symptoms or things that we can see are goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid underneath the chin on the neck. The other thing we might see is increased number of stillbirths. We might see more lambs and kids that are susceptible to cold stress. And that's the number one reason lambs and kids die is starvation, hypothermia. Okay, let's go to copper toxicity. Breed susceptible. Suffolks, black-faced sheep tend to be much better at absorbing copper. So they tend to get in trouble quicker. It takes 2 to 3 months of high copper intake for it to accumulate in the liver. And then we put a stress on the sheep like shearing, like lambing, like going to a fair or being sold to the neighbor. and then they break with copper toxicosis. They will get jaundice, yellow eyelids. If you have them die and cut them open, their fat will be yellow. They'll also have bloody diarrhea and bloody urine because during that hemolytic crisis, the copper all goes out into the bloodstream and it causes a lot of problems. So in Iowa, our problem is normal copper, but we're low on molybdenum. So we have too good an absorption of copper. And the other problem we have in Iowa is we have lots and lots and lots of pigs. Like, we have 3 million people and maybe 20 million pigs. We feed pigs a lot of copper to make them grow faster, so we have a high level of copper in the environment, spread out as manure on the fields, increases the copper level in the feedstuffs, etc. All right. If you've had copper problems in your sheep, the thing to do is use sheep-specific feeds. Never feed any additional copper. Feed some molybdenum, so that's sodium molybdate on the label. They both can be toxic. This is important. I can have too much molybdenum and then I'm copper deficient and we have a problem. I can be copper excess and have a problem. So I want that copper to molybdenum ratio at 6:1 to 10:1. Somewhere in that neighborhood. All right, goat people. This is, copper toxicity doesn't count for you. So you should not use a sheep mineral. You should use a cattle mineral for your sheep or for your goats. Now, what do I do if I have both? If you have both, you need to try to use 2 different mineral feeders, 2 different pens, or you can feed the goats a little differently in terms of added copper in the ration, etc., to get that done. Okay? All right, for goats, boar goats specifically are dark pigmented goats. One of the symptoms of copper on black goats, you'd see a little red tinge to the hair. The boar goats' red hair won't be quite as dark red, as vibrant as it should be, so they're a little lighter colored in terms of that. See, we've been on for 36 minutes. I better get to vitamins. All right, vitamins. Fat soluble are A, D, E, and K. An A vitamin. So we're talking about green feeds. Grass has lots of vitamin A. If sheep have been on pasture in the last 6 months, they cannot be vitamin A deficient. Vitamin A causes problems with reproduction. It causes problems with our various, and now I can't think of the right word, but reproduction is a problem. Corn is yellow. It's got color. It's got and I can't think of it anyway, but that's okay. D, rickets, vitamin D. Okay, so rickets is bone development problems. If your goats and sheep have access to sunshine, they are not going to be vitamin D deficient. If you keep your goats inside for 6 months and no sunshine, they could get D deficient. So we may have to supplement it. Vitamin E, we already talked a lot about. White muscle disease, immune issues, stiff lamb disease, reproduction. Vitamin K is for blood clotting. The body synthesizes that, so we're okay on K. So in all reality, if we've got sheep and goats out on pasture, we get some sunshine, the only vitamin, fat-soluble vitamin we need to worry about is vitamin E. On the B vitamins, as long as there's a healthy rumen, so we haven't created an upset rumen, we've got bacteria that are healthy, thriving in the rumen, they produce enough B vitamins such that we don't need to supplement those to sheep and goats because they're ruminants. Vitamin C, the sheep and goats synthesize that, so that doesn't need to be supported either. So on the vitamins, we're down to vitamin E, maybe. Okay. Oh, what did I do? What did I do? I hit something I shouldn't have hit. Gotta put my glasses on, get out of there. There we go. I hit the wrong spot on the screen. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. So if I've got vitamins in my mineral source, in general, the minerals will inactivate the vitamins. The half-life of vitamins in the mineral bag is 14 to 21 days. I've seen a lot of mineral tags where they have 10 international units of vitamin E. I want Ewes to get 100 to 200 international units a day. So if our mineral was going to provide it, they'd have to eat 10 pounds. And they aren't going to do that. All right. So we think about the critical nutrient vitamin E. White muscle disease interacts with selenium, oxidative stress, and free radicals. So basically, as we think about when our muscles work, as our organs in our body work, as that muscle tissue works, it has to utilize energy to keep going, reacts, it creates free radicals. Peroxides is one of them. The seleniums and vitamin E help take those free radicals and get them out of the system. So it's kind of like when you overwork on lifting weights and your muscles are sore. It's kind of the same thing, except that's lactic acid, not the free radicals. So, but that's why those white muscle lambs, those stiff lamb disease, they're all hunched up. They walk stiff-legged on their rear legs because they're hurting. They're in pain. Late gestation. Stress reduces immunity. So anytime our herds are stressed, those animals have reduced immune capacities. So that means they're more likely to get sick. So cold stress. I shear my ewes in January, and then we have 10 days in a row that it's 0. Those ewes are cold stress, so their immunity is compromised. Milk fever is inadequate calcium in late gestation. Sheep tend to have milk fever before they lamb, not after they lamb. Whereas dairy cattle, dairy goats, milk fever is generally after they start milking because they can't pull enough calcium out of the bones. So as we think about reduced immunity, that leads to more health issues, mastitis, respiratory, uterine infections. And the other thing we need to think about is, and they've done a lot of this in the swine industry, they've tried to keep those pigs super healthy so that they're not wasting energy to mount an immune response, fight off infections. That all takes energy and makes our sheep and goats less efficient. Parasites would be a prime example. That's why they're thin in some respects, because they're putting a lot of energy into fighting the worms, not putting down body fat, growing, etc. Okay. This is a research trial I did at Iowa State University about 15 years ago. In this study, we injected ewes once a week, every week for 5 weeks in late gestation. We gave them 3 cc's of Vital E from pipestone. So we can see before we started, the controls, which is CON ewes, were 1.27 on their serum E values. The treated ewes in late gestation were the same. After we had them on that for 5 weeks, right after they lambed, we bled them. You can see that we increased the serum E levels in the treated ewes by about 25%. Okay? Post-lambing, we still had some increased levels, but by mid-lactation, because we quit treating these ewes, they were still back down and they were below where we were in pre-treatment. And then the milk, because we fed them, gave them more E, we increased the level of E in the milk by 50%. This group over here is ewes that we kept on E in lactation. So we kept hitting them with E shots every week, 3 cc's every week, and those ewes hated us. When they were moved to the chute, they ducked their heads because they knew they were going to get a shot in the neck and they didn't like us. Our base ration was really good feed. It was second cutting alfalfa hay from that year's hay crop and shelled corn. So they were getting good feed, but we got a response with E. The next slide shows us what their lambs look like. At 3 days of age, the lambs 108 versus, as we think about the ewes, a 1.2. So they weren't quite as high. Our vet school would say that's adequate. At Iowa State University, the new NRC would say that's not adequate. And they want animals to be at 2 on their serum E levels. At 28 days, if we didn't treat the ewes anymore, their E levels went back down to 0.9, and their offspring were way low, okay, because we're not getting a lot of E in the milk. If we kept the ewes on E in lactation or put them on E, then the lambs had way more E in them than if they weren't treated. So we got to get some E into those ewes. Now, here's why I said earlier on the selenium shots, the same way on vitamin E or that Vital E strong lamb that we give that's fat and vitamin E supplement, unless we're doing it once a week, we're probably not maintaining a high enough level. So I think it's much better to put the vitamin E in the ewe and goat rations, extra E, so that we get it in the milk and it comes through in the lambs. So I like to feed at least 100 IUs of extra E per head per day in late gestation lactation. Creep feed needs to be at least 40,000 IUs of E per ton. And you could go up to 100,000 if you have trouble. Remember we said selenium and vitamin E work together. Vitamin E is not toxic, but selenium is, so we can feed extra E to get and reduce our need on selenium. Now, like we talked about, don't count on E out of the mineral because it's not there. Now, if you've got your sheep and goats out on grass, green grass, their vitamin E levels are okay. That stuff's really high in E, so we don't need to worry about supplementing out on pasture. Okay? All right, so I don't have any idea whether I've got a micromineral problem or not. There should be some symptoms in the live kids and lambs. But what we could do is, if you're harvesting some animals off the farm to eat, you could submit kidneys and livers from those deads for analysis and get an idea of what your status is. Again, back to sampling your forages or your hays. You can get trace mineral analysis done for about $35 to $50 a sample. So unless I had a problem I thought I had to work on, I wouldn't worry about it. I need read my mineral tags, monitor my mineral intake. Remember that plain salt will not get it done, and sheep have zero nutritional wisdom. Okay? So if I'm on the farm and I need to get some AD&E into my ewes, and I'm feeding a mineral that's a ½ an ounce of intake per day. I got 50 ewes, free choice mineral with ½ an ounce. I can use Kent AD&E premix. It contains 2 million of A, 5 million or ½ million of D, and 400 of E, and then vitamin E at 1,000 or 20,000 IUs per pound. This Kent premix costs you $22 to $24 per 50-pound bag. Vitamin E will cost you about $1 a pound for that product. So for $72, I can buy all the E and AD&E I need in a year for 50 ewes. So I need to shoot for around 3,500 IUs of A and 150 to 300 IUs of E. So if those ewes are eating, or the flock's eating a half an ounce per head per day times 7 days divided by 16 ounces, they should be eating 10.9, 11 pounds a week. So when I said put out mineral once a week, put out 10 pounds, put out 11 pounds. Keep it fresh. Mineral is a lot of salt. Salt draws water. It gets hard, nasty. They don't eat it. They don't like it. Keep it fresh, keep it better. So with that 10 pounds or 11 pounds of mineral, I can add 0.7 pounds of Kent AD&E premix. Now, if I buy a 50-pound bag, that's going to last me over a year. So try to store it in a cool spot. Make sure it stays dry. I would put it in a garbage can, probably a plastic garbage can so it doesn't draw moisture, doesn't get wet. Put it in the garage, put it in the basement, wherever it's cool and dry. And then 2.5 pounds of vitamin E, and that will provide my use of 3,800 IUs of A, 960 vitamin D, and 138 of E. Costs me $3 a week for the whole group, or $3 per ewe per year extra to add that vitamin A, D, and E to the sheep and goats. Now that's only if I think I need it. Okay? You've got to help do the math and help determine that. Now, I got a picture here of a good set of scales. This is a Walmart special. It can do pounds, it can do ounces, it can do grams. It has a tear on it, and it costs all of $20. And it's got a nice big dial on it that I can read and see. So as you start playing around, if you're going to add vitamins and minerals, you got to have a good scale so you know what you're doing. Okay? All right. Susan, I'm done. I'll take questions.
Okay. I'll start with the ones up towards the top. And you may have already answered this one, but I'll make you answer it maybe again. Somebody has sheep and goats together, and so they feed the sheep mineral, and they want to know how they can make sure their goats get enough copper.
Okay, do they ever separate the sheep and goats?
Let's assume not. Let's assume they're raising them together. They can answer in the chat box, though.
Okay, well,
was from Minnesota.
During breeding season, they might be separated. So you could use different minerals at that time.
Probably.
You could orally drench those goats. You could give them a shot of copper. But again, we're talking about small amounts, so you can probably push goats over the edge with too much copper as well. Because I talked about using cattle mineral, probably their requirements are around 25 parts per million instead of 10. So they still don't need a lot, okay? And our feeds are probably, at least the ones I've analyzed, 10 to 20 parts per million, so we only need to add another 5 to 10 parts per million to the diet for the goats.
Okay, there was a question about why FDA controls selenium.
Okay, and that is environmental. You put that down, right? Okay, there has been some issues with manure runoff, mostly out of the California dairies, where they were feeding extremely high levels of selenium. It concentrated in the manure, concentrated in that runoff, and the selenium levels were very high, and it created some toxicity problems in the environment, and that's why the government controls it. And remember, 2 parts per million selenium is toxic, so it's a very narrow range. And I think that's the other reason why they control it. Now, in all reality, the government controls everything, but that's another issue. I'm supposed to behave myself.
Okay, we have had a question from Massachusetts. Somebody that has goats and they have high iron levels in their water, in their well water, and wanted to know what the best bioavailable supplement program would be. They've tried copper boluses, concentrated minerals, lots of
Okay,
different
so
things, I guess.
as we start trying to fix things, the real challenge I have with free choice minerals, super minerals, etc., is it doesn't do good if they don't eat them. And I haven't seen many goats or many sheep that will turn down ground corn or your grain mix or complete feed. I think if you've got to do some things to fix a mineral problem that just free choice mineral doesn't handle, then I'd force feed it. I'd put it in the grain mix every day, top dress it on their hay, somehow to force them to eat it. Try to get more consumption that way.
Here's a question from Maine that you were anticipating.
Maybe.
What about
What
kelp
about kelp?
for trace minerals, especially iodine?
Okay, so kelp's going to be really high in iodine. If you calculate the cost per unit of iodine provided, I'm pretty sure it's going to be more expensive via kelp than other sources. There is nothing wrong with kelp. The problem is it may not be cost effective compared to some other mineral sources. Okay?
Okay, here is a question from Massachusetts. Are weak to no uterine contractions a typical sign of any particular deficiency? I think they were also asking about having stiff and posty legs as well, if those were
in the
signs of
same
any kind of
animals or
deficiency.
different times? Okay.
I don't know.
All right, so here's my take. But I've seen some problems in ewe lambs where they acted like they were in pain. Okay, they were pregnant ewe lambs in late gestation. We actually had a vitamin D problem in those ewe lambs, and on the growth plates when we X-rayed them in their front leg, which would basically be the break joint in a market lamb, they had lots of micro fractures. And so we were having trouble with those ewe lambs because they were so heavy with lamb. They were all carrying twins. We weren't getting enough vitamin D into them, so their calcium phosphorus was messed up. Their bones were getting fractured, and they were sore. And so they didn't move around. Then they get ketotic. Then they get milk fever. They get bad condition. They can't get up to the bunk. They can't compete. So and those sheep have been housed since about probably the 1st November, so it was probably 3 or 4 months indoor housing, not much sunshine, vitamin D issues. So when I think about adult animals, sore feet, sore structured, vitamin D is a concern to me. Could be a calcium phosphorus problem. Okay, there is no doubt. Okay, when we get to minor contractions or weak contractions in these ewes and nannies, it could be mineral, calcium, phosphorus, potassium. It could also be we had a lack of messaging from our hormones to get the uterus ready to contract and get after it. So either one could be part of the problem. But as I think about muscle contractions, then I'd worry about calcium, potassium as part of the potential problem.
A question from Vermont. It says Diamond V is a product that is supposed to increase digestibility and enhance production of B vitamins. Is this really needed?
Probably not. Okay, when we get back to B vitamins, as long as the rumen's healthy, we're okay. So that means we can't insult the rumen by dumping a bunch of starch or corn in there that they're not used to. We're feeding 20-30% hay in the ration so they've got something to chew on. That helps them produce more saliva, which has got buffer in it that keeps the rumen pH up so we don't kill off the bacteria with acidosis. So we should be okay.
Couple
Yeah.
of goat questions for you. Because I know you love them. Do goats synthesize vitamin C?
I assume so, but I do not know that for a fact. Sheep do.
Sheep?
I assume goats do.
Do goats
Yes.
get white muscle disease? Here's a few questions on vitamin E. Does vitamin E come in
You
a
broke
top
it.
dress?
In a
I guess
top
something you could
dress?
top dress
Yes.
on the feet.
Okay. So vitamin E comes in a powder form, 50-pound bags, 10-pound bags. 20,000 international units per pound is the least concentrated mix you can get per pound. So as we think about 100 IUs per day, if we got 20,000 pound in a pound, that'll do. Will that do 200 U's? Is that the right math? Yes, that's the right math. So 1 pound of vitamin E in that would handle 100 head or 200 head. Sorry. But if they're on green grass like they use in the picture, they don't need vitamin E.
That's not in
Yes,
Iowa.
that is in Iowa. That flock is mostly half Romanoff ewes, and he's got about 800. And his son and daughter-in-law have just went to milking ewes.
Is there a whole food like flaxseed that can provide enough vitamin E?
No, I don't think so. But you can do the math. If it takes 100 IUs per day, okay. We think about alfalfa hay is about 18 to 20 IUs per pound. Okay. So if I feed my ewes 5 pounds of alfalfa hay a day, I get 100 IUs into them. But I want to give them another 100 above that. Because as that hay is in storage in the wintertime, the longer it stays in storage, the less vitamin E there is in that hay, as well as vitamin A.
Does browse contain
Probably.
enough vitamin E?
I am assuming it does. Because it's green.
What is the maximum amount of selenium and copper that you should feed a goat or sheep
All right,
per day?
here we go. If you want to be legal, and I know we all want to follow the law, I say with a grin on my face, you can feed 0.69 milligrams per head per day. That is what the FDA says I can legally feed. That's the maximum I can feed. On selenium. On copper. Goats, I'd feed 25 parts per million. So goats are going to eat about 2 kilograms a day, 4.5 pounds. Let's guess that way. That is roughly 50 milligrams, or less than a tenth of a pound, or about a tenth of a pound of copper. Am I still? I'm still working here on my sound, so it's not me.
I think
Okay, that's fine.
to one of our.
All right.
We have a producer in New Jersey who has lambs that
Yes.
are totally grass fed, and he wants to know if you should bother feeding him a free choice mineral block.
All right, so grass-fed lambs, what's the number one risk factor? Parasites. 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 If parasites are a problem, that means stress is a problem. If stress is a problem, then I think we need to make sure we get adequate microminerals into those sheep so they can mount an immune response to the parasites. And they always need salt. Okay? So I would feed them either a general purpose sheep mineral with calcium and phosphorus, or I just feed them a trace mineral salt.
Sticking with the pasture theme, producer in Prince Edward Island in Canada wants to know if you need to feed vitamin E to pasture-fed sheep if they're indoors during the winter.
You don't need to feed it to them while they're on grass, but within 6 weeks after they come off grass, their E levels will be low and they need E supplementation.
I think I'm going to give you a question that's really hard to answer because I'm not always sure the answer to this. How do you keep the poop and the pee out of the mineral box, whether it's up off the ground or on the ground?
You don't keep it out necessarily. I put my mineral feeders pretty high. They're probably 18 inches at least, if not 2 feet. So lambs couldn't get into them if they wanted to. Baby lambs. Ewes can get into them. So I'd have them as high as the animal's dock. Okay? Think about that. Think of how high the dock is on your sheep and goats. Now probably need to be the average size one, not the giant or the smallest one. Because then it's a lot harder for them to pee and poop in it. Okay? But if you only put out a week's supply, you only ruin a week, not a month or a year.